Chapter 4. All of this was completely out of the realm of possibility, and Tony was more than a little agitated. It just didn't make any sense. None of it did. How was it that his tablet kept alerting him that Peter was in the room when Peter obviously wasn't present at all? Was there something wrong with his satellite? A bug in the system? Or maybe, unless... May, Tony called out carefully to the distressed woman who was currently pacing with worry about her nephew. You don't think that Peter took the tracker out of his suit again, do you? Like he did in DC? Yeah. He had told May all about that story, how Peter had put the tracker from his suit on a hotel lamp of all things. It had been funny to Tony after he had calmed down about it. But it was no longer humorous to him now as he thought on it. Peter wouldn't do that again, would he? Hadn't he learned the first time how disastrous that had all turned out? And how important it was that Tony had a way to trace him if Peter ever found himself in a tight spot. Like right now, for instance? Was his rebellion really taking him so far that it extended its reach to Tony as well? And not just with May? May immediately shook her head, before pausing, suddenly looking uncertain. I didn't think that he would have, but he did lie to me about calling you tonight. So, I guess anything is possible. Tony stood from the bar stool that he had been sitting on, and walked over to the couch where his tablet indicated Peter was located. He pulled the couch out and proceeded to look behind it, searching for the small, little microchip that was Peter's tracker. It was nowhere in sight. Tony frowned and looked down at his tablet once again. And what he saw caused his eyes to widen. His tracker moved slightly, Tony commented lowly to himself, though it still caused May to gasp aloud. He peered up at the couch that was now in the middle of the living room and back down to his tablet. But not in that direction, he said, indicating to the couch that had been moved in the opposite trajectory that Peter's dot was currently on. Tony turned his whole body towards the wall that the couch had just vacated. It moved more in the opposite direction. I think I'm drifting off fast. Spider-Man said, his voice laden thick with sleep. When they had finally released each other from their hug earlier, they both silently decided to lie down on the bed, resting parallel while staring at the ceiling on their backs. It was clear that Spider-Man was nearing the point of exhaustion. His eye lenses drooped nearly every 3 seconds as he fought to stay awake. Well, that makes sense. Mary Jane whispered back as she turned her position on the bed, now facing him. You've had quite the busy night. Tends to exhaust people. Spider-Man merely slowly nodded, in a tired and distracted manner before he turned his body on his side to face her as well. Are you sure that it's all right if I stay here? He asked, his voice sounding hesitant. As if she would kick him out. Even if she wanted to, he would be dead on his feet. Luckily, seeing him disappear from her life was the very last thing that she wanted. No. Her desires now centered around how much she wanted to cuddle close to his chest and feel his arms around her again. But for some reason, she found herself tentative. With other boys, she tended to flirt as though it were nothing more than an amusing game, something to do to appease the boy in question for a while before they went their separate ways forever. But this was far from a game. This felt real. Raw. Spider-Man somehow managed to get through all of the defensive walls that she had built in just a matter of hours, and the strangest part? She found herself far from unhappy for it. In fact, it was a welcome change. The light feeling inside of her was something that she could easily get used to from how warm it made her feel. Of course, Mary Jane said immediately, her tone indicating that she wouldn't have it any other way. Spider-Man nodded his acceptance and gratitude. Good night, Mary Jane. His masked head burrowed further into the pillow, and Mary Jane couldn't help but smile fondly at the endearing action. Don't let the bedbugs bite, Spider. Spider-Man let out a lone amused breath before his breathing evened out, and Mary Jane knew that she had lost him to the land of dreams. Mary Jane sighed, not at all tired yet, as she thought over what their options were. Their best bet was to get Spider-Man to Tony Stark if he didn't regain his full memory soon. But Mary Jane found her innermost thoughts and desires rebelling against the idea. She wanted to be the one to help Spider-Man with his recovery. And she knew the reason why. She didn't want to let him go. If he left, who knows when she would see him again. If she would ever see him again. The very thought was abhorrent, but this might very well be the only time she would ever spend time with him. And she wanted it to last if that were the case. He did say that he wouldn't forget about you. Her thoughts pointed out to her. Mary Jane frowned at that. Sure, he said that he wouldn't forget her, But that didn't mean that he would go out of his way to spend any time with her. Especially after he regained his memory. Once he is fully aware of his life and the situation at hand, he might go back on his promise to her. Even people with full memories had those that faded every single day. With the passing of time, she will become a faceless figure in his mind's eye. Just a simple good Samaritan that happened to be in the right place at the right time, but no one that he would go out of his way for. He was a busy guy, after all. While Mary Jane. Her memory of this night would be acute. Something that she would look back on frequently. Hell, it might be a story she would tell her grandkids about someday. But that would be it. It would be a short tale, the story of Mary Jane and Spider-Man. But one worth telling. With a heavy sigh, Mary Jane turned onto her back, staring at the ceiling with furrowed brows. The current line of her thinking was, knock knock knock. The abrupt noise startled her out of her thoughts enough that she nearly fell out of the bed. Sitting up, Mary Jane stared at the door skeptically. Who could it be? Especially at this hour? And with her Aunt Anna out of town. Her eyes turned over to Spider-Man on the bed. And saw that the banging noise hadn't disturbed his sleep at all. Spider-Man was well and truly dead to the world. The knocking came again, this time more insistent. Mary Jane stood, on unsteady feet, and slowly made her way over to the door. She stopped in front of it and leaned in close to peer through the eye-hole, and Mary Jane gasped, stepped back, and immediately unlocked the deadbolt. Throwing open the door wide, she stood there and gaped at the appearance of Tony Stark in her Aunt Anna's doorway. He was looking at her warily, with distrustful eyes, as if he were trying to judge her character with one single look. Why, she stuttered. Yeah. I know who I am. He said in an abrupt and curt tone paired with a roll of his eyes as he waved her off. Listen, I'm looking for... I know who you're looking for, Mary Jane interrupted, breathless, but now all of a sudden able to find her voice. She stepped back to allow entrance for the billionaire superhero. He's right in the room there. On the bed. Tony Stark's eyes widened and didn't wait for any further invitation as he stepped forward, giving himself access into the apartment and to the bedroom she had pointed to. Mary Jane followed him and nearly ran right into his back as he paused right in the open doorway. She watched Mr. Stark's face as he took in the brightly colored superhero sleeping on the bed. And to say that Mr. Stark's entire body melted with relief would be an understatement. Thank God. Eyes swiveling to the side, Mr. Stark turned his attention to look at her out of the corner of his vision. There was an underlying suspicion that swam in the depths of them, but it seemed that he was choosing not to voice it aloud quite yet. How long has he been unconscious? Mary Jane leaned against the doorway frame opposite of him as she crossed her arms with leisure. He wasn't just a moment ago. He only just fell asleep. It was clear that Mr. Stark wasn't pleased by her answer, judging by the distinct downturning of his lips. Then why didn't he just leave before? Unless... He turned to look at her fully now. He isn't hurt, is he? Looking over at the boy in question on the bed, Mary Jane bit her bottom lip. According to what he told me, he only had a few scrapes and bruises. But those have apparently already healed. But... then why didn't he at least check in to let us know that he was all right? Tony snapped, looking quite agitated as he closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. She could tell that he was trying to restrain his emotions while in front of her, but he wasn't succeeding all that well. Mary Jane held up her hands defensively. He didn't know, okay? Look, Spider-Man, he has amnesia. Mr. Stark's eyes snapped to hers, tension once again taking over his body. What happened? So, she told him everything that occurred. With the explosion, Spider-Man hitting his head on the metal dumpster, and Mary Jane finding him and taking him here. He's been remembering bits and pieces. Mary Jane continued, watching Mr. Stark but unable to get a read on his emotions. Like he remembers a bit about you and how he originally gotten his powers. But the rest is just blank for now. I think that his super healing is mending his brain as we speak. She finally stopped talking, waiting for any sort of reaction from Mr. Stark. Approval? More of his ire? Anything was better than the silence. But he didn't give her much of one. Instead, he walked forward and sat down on the chair next to the bed, looking at Spider-Man's prone form. Mary Jane stayed standing in the doorway, watching them both. Until finally, Mr. Stark broke the silence. He still has his mask on. It was just an observation, but still, Mary Jane nodded, even though Mr. Stark wasn't looking at her to see the movement. It just didn't seem right. He wears a mask for a reason, and he was completely helpless. He was putting all of his trust in me. I couldn't betray it. Tony turned his head to look at her, this time with appraising eyes. I guess we can be glad that it was you who had found him rather than anyone else. Thank you for taking care of him. And for keeping his secret safe. Melting a bit against the doorframe, Mary Jane smiled at the praise. Up until that moment, Mr. Stark had been nothing but abrasive towards her. It seemed that she had finally won some approval points from the man and gotten past his hard exterior. It was really nothing. If anything, Spider-Man made some great company. You ever notice that he tends to talk a lot? Mr. Stark barked out a laugh. The noise still didn't serve to wake Spider-Man from his deep sleep. Don't I know it? The kid won't ever learn how to shut up. Mary Jane was surprised by the sound of affection in Mr. Stark's voice as he said this. It was clear that Spider-Man and Tony Stark were closer than anyone realized. The thought caused a smile to come to her face, knowing that she was putting Spider-Man in good hands. How did you even know that he was here? She asked suddenly, curious. Mr. Stark held up the tablet that she had forgotten he was holding. There's a tracker in his suit. Put there for instances just like these. Mary Jane grinned. Convenient. Yeah, Tony said as he suddenly stood, startling her by the abruptness of the action. So, listen. We better get going. Mary Jane stood up straight, feeling disappointment coursing through her. They were going to leave? Just like that? Oh. Of course. Mr. Stark nodded before he bent over and gently lifted Spider-Man's lithe body up over his shoulder. Spider-Man didn't even stir from his slumber. Thanks again for taking care of him. I really appreciate it. And his voice really did indicate that he did. Mary Jane walked ahead of them, opening the door wide enough for them to go through. As Mr. Stark walked out into the hallway, Mary Jane couldn't help but stop him. Mr. Stark? Mr. Stark paused, looking back at her with a single, raised eyebrow. Taking the time to adjust his hold on Spider-Man. Yeah, kid? Mary Jane bit her lip and tucked strands of her red hair behind her ear. Take care of him, okay? Mr. Stark stared at her for a brief moment, before smiling and saying, Always do, kid. See you around. Mary Jane nodded before she closed the door after them, turning her body so that she leaned heavily against the thick wood. It was probably the last time that she would ever get to see Spider-Man. And she didn't even get to say goodbye.